Today we honor Susan Tucker Simmons and her family.
Susan Tucker Simmons was born October 20th, 1864, at Morgan County, Utah, the third oldest child of James and Betsy Lurwell Tucker. Her parents had immigrated to the Salt Lake Valley from England, East Down, Devonshire, in 1860. Her parents were married at Florence, Nebraska, on or about May 26, 1860, en route to the Salt Lake Valley. They moved to Morgan about 1863, after their first child, Mary Priscilla, was born. Susan was blessed October 28, 1864, by Richard Fry. Susan grew up and spent her childhood in Morgan between 1864 and 1885. Since she was the third oldest, she shared many of the home care responsibilities with Mary Priscilla. Since her mother was a fastidious housekeeper, Susan learned the value of a clean house at an early age. The boys helped Father Tucker, who was a shoemaker, but the girls had to do washing, ironing, sewing, cleaning, and food preparation. Susan was later known to be an excellent cook. Animals had to be cared for, and milking accomplished morning and evening by the family. Susan was baptized August 3rd, 1873, by William Henning. Aletha, her daughter, says, "Black-eyed Susan was a nickname given to her by her friends. She was small in stature, about 5 feet tall, and weighed no more than 100 pounds. She was beautiful, with large, expressive, nearly black eyes, dark brown hair, always curled and neat. I will remember her in the paper curlers she used." Susan was rebaptized October 17, 1875, by Charles Turner, and reconfirmed the same day by Samuel Francis. Susan received her patriarchal blessing September 2nd, 1879, from Patriarch William McBride at Morgan, Utah.
Susan met John James Simmons in Morgan. They probably knew each other for many years, since they were born in the same year, 1864. Whether their courtship was long or short, we do not know. John James' father, George, was a skilled carpenter. He built the first brick house in Morgan, and John James was the fourth child born in the Morgan community. John was born in a log house with a clay roof, March 7, 1864. He was blessed March 7, 1865, by Charles Turner, and baptized March 7, 1872, by Robert Hogue. John was confirmed the same day. He received the Aaronic priesthood and was ordained a deacon October 14, 1877, by Thomas Lurwell. He was ordained a teacher December 24, 1883, by Ebenezer Crouch. Susan Tucker married John James Simmons October 14, 1885, in the Logan Temple, Cache County, Utah. They were endowed the same day. John Simmons wrote, "We went to the temple in a freight wagon with 1 mule and 1 horse as our team. It took us 3 days to make the trip, from Morgan to Logan, Utah, about 60 miles. John James Simmons further writes, "I built a 2-room brick house before I was married. I planned and matched all my lumber by hand, and it was all rough red pine. This is the house that they initiated their married life in. 6 children were born here. John James Simmons married Susan Tucker at age 21. His account says, "Our first child was born March 24, 1887, and we named him John Wynn. He weighed 10.5 pounds. I built 4 more rooms onto my house in 1886 and 1887, and more children were born."
Pearly Susan was born June 28, 1889. Aletha Maud was born November 9, 1891. Earl was born December 25, 1893, and Claude November 27, 1895. John and Susan lived in a nice home, but were to face many hardships. Just 5 days after John Wynne was born, John James Simmons had a very bad accident.
We were lining a lime kiln, and I was on the scaffold, and it was loaded to its capacity with big rocks. I kept telling this man that we would all be killed if he didn't stop putting on so many rocks. But he put on another one, and as he did, the scaffold broke, and down it went with me on it. The rocks weighed from 95 to 125 pounds each, and they all fell on top of me. It was just a miracle that I was not smashed to pieces, but I have felt the effect of it all my life in my back. This was just another careless trick, but it was a terrible shock to my dear wife in her condition. John James writes further, I was called to go on a mission on March 9, 1896, and was set apart by Apostle Heber J. Grant to labor in the Northern States Mission. John labored for 2 years in the state of Wisconsin. Upon his return to Susan and their 5 children, he writes, My dear wife helped me with all her power. We had 5 children when I went out to do the work of the Lord, and he provided a way, for if there is a will, there is a way. I returned on February 16, 1868, and it was a sad homecoming. Claude died with diphtheria and was buried the day before I arrived, and Earl lived for 24 hours after. They were 2 most beautiful boys. When I arrived home, we didn't have any income to speak of, but the Lord provided the way. I rented my mother's small farm, and before I went into the mission, my father and I built many caskets to bury the dead. The 6th child was born on December 13, 1889, and was named Leo Tucker Simmons. He was the last of 6 children born at Morgan, Utah.
In the spring of 1900, John James Simmons left Susan and 4 children in Morgan for about 6 weeks, while he explored the Bighorn Basin with the intent of settling there. He made the trip in the company of 16 men, including Apostle Abraham O. Woodruff and Stake President Byron Sessions. As a consequence of the exploration, Susan and John decided to go and then prepared the family to live in the Bighorn country. The home in Morgan was sold and possessions prepared for the horse and wagon trek of more than 450 miles. Selected possessions were packed in their pioneer wagon, pulled by 2 small but tough horses named Puss and Doll. A canvas tent and wagon cover were their only shelter. The children slept in the wagon. The children, Wynne, Pearlie, Aletha, and Leo, aged 13, 11, 8.5, and 2.5 respectively, were expected to take varying responsibilities from cooking to tending the horses. The route was essentially north from Morgan to Byron, where the family eventually settled. The family left Morgan, Utah on May 1, 1900, and arrived in Bighorn country on the 2nd day of June, 1900, a total of 32 days or about 13 miles per day. Much of the trip retraces the old Utah, California, Oregon Pioneer Trail, but in the reverse direction to South Pass. From South Pass north, the route retraced the one used by the mountain men, or fur traders, before 1847, when the Utah Mormons began to arrive. On the old Pioneer Trail, the family saw many of the pioneer graves beside the road with buffalo heads for markers.
John James Simmons writes, We arrived at Bighorn, Wyoming on June 2, 1900, tired and worn, into a country that was desolate and barren. There were many rattlesnakes. It seemed discouraging to leave our comforts behind and find such a country, but we knew that if we put forth every effort to do as we were asked, we would be blessed by our Heavenly Father. Susan and the children arrived with no apparent ill effects. and were quite willing to meet the challenges of the day and time. When the family arrived at the Bighorn Basin, they were in a desolate, barren land with a short growing season. Consequently, getting water on the land was paramount to survival. On May 27th, a few days before the Simmons arrived, the major portion of the saints gathered at the place where a canal was to be started. The site was then dedicated, and canal building began the next day. The canal was to be 37 miles, long enough to carry water to irrigate 15,000 acres. It took 4 years to build. Permission to build the canal had previously been worked out with people who had attained land and water rights from the state of Wyoming. It was the success of this agreement that caused the Mormons to settle in the Bighorn Basin. The agreement for water and land was worked out between the Mormon Church and previous settlers in the area. Actually, Nate Salzberg and W.F. Cody, who were partners, signed over a land and water rights permit issued by the state of Wyoming to the officers of the Bighorn Basin Colonization Company. All of these negotiations were conducted by Abraham O. Woodruff, a general authority of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and who had the responsibility for the colonization of the Bighorn Basin. Susan Simmons was one of the 6 women traveling in the second company led by George H. Taggart, in which there were 16 wagons, 22 men, 6 women, 27 children, and 36 head of horses. Evidently, mostly the 7 companies traveled over the Owl Mountains to Meeteetse, to Cody, thence to Byron. However, Company 2, with many children, traveled a different lowland route from Washakie down the old Missouri Trail and Owl Creek to Basin, and down the Bighorn River to Burlington and across the hills to Foster Gulch. Then they forded the Shoshone River to Byron, arriving on June 2nd, 1900, about 9 days after the over-mountain parties arrived.
Since the main effort was to dig the canal and get water to the land in the summer of 1900, everyone had to live in their wagons and tents. Much of the food had to be taken, for what was transported from Utah or purchased elsewhere and wagoned in. For a time, horse teams were kept constantly on the road between the canal building camp and Bridger, Montana, hauling oats for the horses and supplies for people. Susan Simmons became pregnant in June 1900, about the time they arrived in Bighorn Basin. Thus, between taking care of the 4 living children, husband, and living in temporary living quarters, Morgan was born March 18, 1901. Morgan was born in a dugout in Byram, Wyoming, and I, Zella, was born September 8, 1904, in the house Patty Hatch owned. John James and Susan entered the merchandising business in 1901. They took over the co-op store, which they later purchased. A log house was built for the family. An addition was built to house the store. After the larger store was built, this served as a parlor for the home. Susan contended with another situation which would greatly impact her life and the lives of her children. Before John James Simmons was married to Susan Tucker, he was ordained a 70 in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by Robert Campbell under the direction of Seymour B. Young on October 18, 1884. At this time I held my arm to the square and promised I would marry more than one wife, and was expected to do so.
According to John James Simmons, I told Susan Tucker she was the first but not the last. John further writes, "One day my wife and I went to a meeting, and here this girl sang and played, so I turned to Susan and said, 'There is the same picture I saw in my dreams. There she is, and I know it.' And she, Susan, said, John, I'll be the happiest woman ever lived if you can get her. On January 10, 1903, I took this lovely lady to the Salt Lake Temple to be my second wife. According to Eletha, the marriage was kept secret because it violated both ecclesiastical and civil law. Bertha lived in her own house apart from Susan Simmons' home. Thus it was apparent that either Bertha did not live in with the Simmons family for a few years, or they had infrequent association for several years. Zella, Carl, and May were born after 1903. John was ordained an high priest August 25, 1907 by Richard E. Egan. The first child of John James and his second wife, Bertha Sessions, was born October 29, 1911 at Byron, Wyoming. John James Simmons, with Bertha and child Bertha, known by Peggy, were advised by the stake president to move to Oakley, Idaho. They moved on March 9, 1912. John was 52, Bertha 30.
This created many hardships for Susan's family. Susan earned money any way she could, washing clothes, scrubbing, and cleaning for hire. She also took in boarders and sold butter. Wynne bought the store from John James before he moved to Oakley. 4 years later, 1916, a 40-acre tract of land was purchased in Oakley, on which a house was built at the cost of $4,000 for Susan. John James Simmons convinced Susan that she and the children should come to Oakley. At this time, Wynne was married, Pearlie was married, and Eletha was preparing to go on a mission to the northern states. Susan liquidated all of their belongings except a piano and came to Oakley with Leo, Morgan, Zella, Carl, and May. Susan and the children traveled by train, leaving Byron, Wyoming, June 18, 1916, and arriving in Oakley, June 21, 1916. Zella said, "I remember Mother selling all the furniture except the piano, and I cried as each piece was sold."
Then I, John James, bought her, Susan, a nice brick home in town, Oakley, and gave Bertha the new home that I built. I, John James, divided my property between them, Susan and Bertha. John has written, "I thank the Lord for the 2 lovely wives that he gave me, for they always stood by me through the trials and tribulations, giving me much encouragement and enjoying the good things of life as well." Susan's objective in Oakley was to raise her children and to give them spiritual and cultural heritage fitting to the local society. Susan was a tolerant, hard-working, independent person. She took in boarders, scrubbed clothes, sold milk and butter to eke out an existence. When the children were old enough to work, they worked to support the family. This was truly a family affair struggling for survival. Susan Tucker, born late 1864, arrived during the most critical year of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was president, and Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman were organized to defeat the South about a year later. The Western territories were essentially isolated from this Eastern conflict. The Mormons were settling many parts of the Great Basin. The Mormons had been in the Salt Lake Valley for 17 years. Thus the struggle for just survival was being overcome. Saints in Utah were growing their own crops, breeding their own herds, and manufacturing goods to meet their local needs. The railroad was soon to have a big impact on what goods would be available and how fast one could travel into and out of the West, and how rapid communications would become. It was the age of rapid transition in the West. Fortunately, the West was spared from the spoils of the Civil War that took place in the South and the middle states of the North. Thus Susan was born in the reasonable, well-developed community of Morgan, Utah, through which a transcontinental railroad passed.
Susan raised a wonderful family of 4 boys and 4 girls. All were successful in their lives. Physically, Grandmother Susan Tucker was less than 5 feet tall, slender with deep-set dark eyes and dark hair, black. She was a very attractive woman, as our pictures demonstrate. Most particularly, she moved rapidly, organized her house and her children around her. It did not seem to matter what time of day it was, work always came first. Ralph Campbell, a grandson about 10 years old after his first visit to Susan's home in Oakley, commented, "Grandmother eats fast, walks fast, and talks fast." Aletha has attributed her industry and personal drive to her mother. It seems that all of Susan's children possess this energetic trait. Susan has known poverty, but in spite of bad times she has made do with what she had, whether it was a little bit of garden produce or a lot, or whether she had new clothes or old. Rosalind, Susan's oldest granddaughter, remembers how good her grandmother was to her. She was always showing things to do and to look up, especially to the birds, then the nests and eggs in the trees, and the flowers that she planted around the house. Rose continues by remembering how clean Grandmother was and how nice her home always looked. In her nice brick home in downtown Oakley, her parlor was off limits to the children. It was always spotless. Susan always had cookies in the cookie jar for the grandchildren. Rose noted that Grandmother always washed dishes immediately after meals, and then put fresh soap in the dishwater in the dishpan, and washed out the washcloth and dish towel, and then hung them out to dry. Rose further comments, "Grandma was so little, it always amazes me how small she was, but so full of vim and vigor and vitality. I don't think she ever stopped working."
Wynne, Susan's son, has said, "Mother cooked so many loaves of bread in camp stoves that when she had a real home comfort range, she thought she was in heaven. She always loved to cook." Wynne has said that Grandma Susan took a lot of interest in her family and was anxious for their success. "She inspired me and was always kind and considerate and had very good judgment. She was also fair-minded and ambitious. She was a great lady." Glenn, her oldest grandson, states, "When I was 18, I lived a full year with Grandma. She was small in stature, but large in intestinal fortitude and brains. I loved her and respected her." On Conference Sunday, November 17, 1940, Susan Simmons invited her husband John and second wife Bertha to dinner following the conference session. She hurried that day and prepared dinner as she always did, then rushed to the church several blocks away. She sat down by her husband, gave a big sigh, and was gone. She died of an apparent heart attack. Susan was buried Thursday, November 21st, in the Oakley Cemetery.
Barbara, a granddaughter who lived near her grandmother in Oakley between age 2 and 9, writes, "Grandma and I must have had a special bond, because I knew the moment she died. It was Sunday afternoon in Salt Lake City, and I was dressing to go out on a date. Suddenly I felt as though some inner part of me had escaped my body and mind, and so I had irretrievably lost a part of myself. When Mother called me the next day, I blurted out, 'Grandma died.'" Barbara writes further, "I knew little of Grandma Susan's background, really. I just knew her as a very important support person in my life, as loving, almost adoring mother to her own 8 living children, as a cute, smile, wiry woman who seemed to be able to do anything, as a plural wife who never had a bitter word toward Grandpa or for the second family. Last summer I made a trip to Oakley after 60 years had passed away. I found Grandma's grave and took time to tell her how special she was to me. I hope somewhere out there she heard me."
John James Simmons died Friday, June 29, 1962, at Ogden, Weber County, Utah, and was buried Monday, July 2nd, at Morgan.
As descendants of these fine and faithful people, let us remember their strong, wonderful qualities and try to live our lives to make them proud of us.